The first time I turned the key to my old cabin after 3 long years away, I felt a strange mixture of excitement, nostalgia, and a creeping unease that I couldn't quite shake, like the land itself was whispering that something had changed in my absence. And as the rusty lock finally gave way, I stepped inside, expecting to be greeted by the familiar smell of aged pine, dust, and the faint lingering aroma of campfires from years gone by. But instead, I was met with a shockingly sterile smell, as if someone had tried to air out recently. And when I walked back outside to take in the view of the land I had worked so hard to maintain before I had left, I froze in disbelief because nailed to nearly every tree and even mounted on stakes along the gravel driveway were glaring, bright red and white, trespassing, private property signs, signs I had never put up, signs that made it look like I was the one intruding on my own land. And as I pulled one of them down to inspect it, I noticed the logo of the local HOA plastered in the corner, which made no sense because my cabin was not under their jurisdiction, never had been, and I had deliberately purchased this slice of secluded wilderness precisely to avoid meddling from neighborhood busybodies who loved telling everyone how to live. So the sight of those signs immediately set my blood boiling, and my first thought was of Karen, the infamous self appointed queen of the nearby HOA, who had a reputation that preceded her. Even before I had left 3 years ago to take care of family business in another state, I had already dealt with her once when she marched onto my property uninvited to inform me that my unkempt wilderness was bringing down the property values of the homes miles away, and I had politely but firmly told her to leave, explaining that my land was private outside the HOA and absolutely none of her concern, but I could still remember the way her face twisted with that fake smile that didn't reach her eyes, the way her voice dripped with passive aggression when she said, "Well, you'll find that communities work better when everyone plays by the same rules," and I had laughed it off back then, thinking she'd eventually get bored and move on to harassing her actual HOA members. Not me, but standing here 3 years later, pulling down sign after sign, I realized she hadn't just moved on. She had doubled down, staking some imaginary claim to my property and trying to scare away anyone who might come near it. And the more I thought about it, the angrier I became because in my absence, I had trusted that the land would sit quietly waiting for me, but instead it looked like someone had been actively trying to rewrite the boundaries of ownership and that someone's fingerprints were all over the charade. So I did what anyone would do. I grabbed my phone, snapped pictures of the signs, the driveway, the trees, everything that showed the trespassing notices branded with a HOA's name, and as I did, I felt a strange determination settle over me. Because this was no longer just about coming back to enjoy a peaceful weekend at the cabin. This was about defending what was rightfully mine, the land my grandfather had left me, the cabin I had built with my own hands, and the solitude I had fought to preserve. And the more I thought back over the years, the clearer it became that Karen must have seen my absence as an opportunity, like a predator circling when it smells weakness, and I could practically hear her shrill voice justifying it to herself. Well, if he's not here, someone has to take care of it, and clearly he doesn't know how to maintain property in a community setting, and it made my jaw clench because I had spent countless weekends clearing brush, repairing fences, stacking firewood, and taking care of the cabin, while she spent her weekends filing petty complaints and issuing warnings about mailbox heights and lawn grass lengths. So, who was she to stake a claim here on the one patch of ground that was supposed to be safe from her reach? And as the sun dipped lower in the sky that first evening back, painting the lake with streaks of orange and gold, I stood on the porch staring out at the water, gripping one of those fake no trespassing signs in my hand like it was evidence in a trial, and I promised myself I wasn't going to let this go, because if Karen thought she could erase my presence from this land with cheap plastic, signs, and HOA bluster, she was about to learn that I was back, I wasn't afraid, and I wasn't leaving again, and with that promise echoing in my head, I walked back inside, set my bag down on the old wooden table, and began planning exactly how I was going to confront the storm that I knew was coming. Because if Karen had the audacity to plaster her authority over my property without my permission, then she would have the audacity to show up in person to defend it. And I wanted to be ready when she did. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of tires crunching over gravel, and when I stepped out onto the porch with a steaming mug of coffee in my hand, I wasn't surprised in the least to see a shiny black SUV creeping slowly up my driveway, as if it belonged here, and sure enough, as the vehicle stopped and the driver's side door swung open, there she was, Karen herself, perfectly coiffed hair helmeted into place, oversized sunglasses perched on her nose, and a clipboard clutched to her chest like she was about to conduct some sort of inspection, and the way she strutted toward me, heels clicking against the rocks, made my stomach turn because her confidence reeked of entitlement, the kind of blind arrogance that comes from years of pushing people around and rarely being told no. But I had already decided last night that this time she wasn't going to steamroll me, not here, not on my own property. So I leaned casually against the porch railing, sipped my coffee, and waited for her to speak first. And of course she did, her voice sharp and commanding as she declared, "Sir, you're trespassing. This land has been designated as protected community property under HOA oversight, and I'll have to ask you to leave immediately." And I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because the audacity of it all was so absurd that it pushed me right past anger into a kind of dark amusement, and I held up my phone, flipping through the photos I had taken the night before of the signs and her HOA logo, and said, "Karen, you know full well this land is mine. It's been mine since before you ever thought about sticking your nose out here. And you've got about 3 seconds to explain what the hell you're doing posting signs on my property." But instead of backing down, she doubled down, which I should have expected, crossing her arms and saying, "Ownership is a community concept, and when you abandon land for years without proper upkeep, it falls under HOA. Stewardship for the good of the neighborhood, and frankly, your absence has been a problem. So I've taken steps to protect this land from squatters and vagrants, which means you're the one who needs to provide proof of ownership before you set foot here again." And that smug smirk on her face when she said it made my blood boil, because she knew full well I had the deed, I had the paperwork, everything was legally airtight, but she was trying to bluff to intimidate me into retreating, because that's what bullies do. They push and push until someone pushes back, and I could see in her eyes that she wasn't used to being challenged, so I set my coffee down on the porch rail, walked slowly down the steps until I was standing right in front of her, and said low and steady, "Karen, I don't need to prove a damn thing to you. This land has been in my family for generations, and your little signs don't change that. So take your SUV, take your clipboard, and get off my property before I call the sheriff and report you for trespassing." And I'll never forget the way her mouth fell open, like no one had ever dared talk to her that way before, but she quickly snapped it shut, adjusted her sunglasses, and hissed, "You'll regret this. We'll see what the HOA legal team has to say," before spinning on her heel and storming back to her car. And as she drove off in a spray of gravel and dust, I felt a flicker of satisfaction, but it was quickly replaced by the uneasy realization that this wasn't over, not by a long shot, because if Karen said she was bringing in the HOA legal team, that meant she'd be scheming, plotting, and filing whatever nonsense paperwork she could cook up to make my life miserable, and I knew her type well enough to know she wouldn't let go easily. So I spent the rest of the day documenting everything, pulling down more of her signs, stacking them in a pile on the porch like trophies, and photographing every corner of the property to prove that it was clearly outside the boundaries of any HOA jurisdiction, and while I worked, my mind kept drifting back to memories of the first time I met her. When she came marching down my driveway uninvited years ago, her voice dripping with false concern about community standards and property values, and how I had brushed it off as a nuisance, not realizing I was planting the seeds of a bigger battle that would come to full bloom in my absence. And now that she had escalated to physically posting signs and claiming my land, I understood that this was a war of attrition, a test of wills, and the only way to win was to be more stubborn than she was, and trust me, I had 3 years of pent-up frustration and determination to draw from. Because while she was filing complaints about fence heights and mailbox paint colors, I had been taking care of real problems, real responsibilities, the kind of life challenges that teach you how to endure, how to fight when it matters, and that gave me confidence that I could outlast her, no matter how many tricks she had up her sleeve. But still, as the stars came out that night and the forest around my cabin fell into its peaceful rhythm of crickets and rustling leaves, I couldn't shake the thought that Karen wasn't done, that she'd be back, and that next time, she wouldn't come alone, she'd come with reinforcements, papers, maybe even law enforcement she had duped into thinking she had authority here. And so I prepared myself, not just to defend my land physically, but to expose her lies, to shine a light on her abuse of power. And as I sat there on the porch with the pile of confiscated HOA signs at my feet, I whispered to myself the same promise I had made yesterday. This is my land, my cabin, and no one, not even Karen with her endless arrogance, is going to take it from me. The following week was quiet, almost too quiet. And though I spent the days repairing the old cabin roof, clearing brush around the fire pit, and hiking down to the lake to make sure the dock was still sturdy, I never let my guard down because I knew Karen well enough by now to understand that silence was her way of plotting. And sure enough, late one afternoon as I was hauling firewood from the shed, I heard the sound of multiple engines coming up the driveway, and when I looked toward the entrance, I saw not just Karen's black SUV, but two more cars behind it, one a sleek silver sedan and the other a sheriff's department cruiser, and my stomach tightened at the sight because it meant she had escalated exactly the way I feared, trying to drag the law into her personal crusade. So I wiped the sweat from my brow, set down the logs, and stood tall as the caravan rolled to a stop. And the first to step out was Karen, of course, her sunglasses gleaming and her posture radiating smug triumph, followed by a man in a suit carrying a briefcase who I assumed was the so-called HOA legal team, and finally the sheriff who adjusted his hat and looked at me with a neutral expression that gave nothing away. And as the group made their way up the drive, Karen spoke first, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "Sheriff, this is the individual I reported for trespassing on HOA-protected property. I trust you'll handle this matter accordingly." And the sheriff glanced between us, clearly confused before saying, "Ma'am, this land is marked as private in county records, and as far as I can tell, this gentleman is well within his rights to be here." But Karen quickly cut him off, waving her manicured hand toward the suited man. "That's where you're mistaken, officer, because our association has assumed stewardship of this land under community protection statutes, and my lawyer will explain how his absence created a legal vacancy that the HOA was obligated to fill." And the lawyer stepped forward, flipping open his briefcase and pulling out a stack of papers, but before he could start his spiel, I pulled my own folder from the porch table, the deed, the tax receipts, and the surveyor's maps I had dug out from storage the night after Karen first confronted me, and I handed them to the sheriff, saying firmly, "Everything you need is right here. Legal proof that this land has been mine since the day I inherited it, and no HOA or busybody neighbor can change that." And as the sheriff flipped through the documents, nodding slowly, Karen's smug confidence began to waver, though she quickly tried to recover, barking, "Those are outdated. This land has been neglected, and neglect changes ownership rights when the community steps in for preservation." But the sheriff raised an eyebrow and said, "Ma'am, neglect doesn't transfer property, taxes do, and he's paid them. So as far as the law is concerned, this is his property, not yours." And the color drained from Karen's face, though she immediately pivoted to her usual tactic, raising her voice and trying to make it sound like she was the victim, exclaiming, "Well, it's not safe for the community. There have been reports of strange people loitering here. I'm only doing my duty to protect everyone." But the sheriff wasn't buying it, shaking his head as he handed my documents back to me. "I don't see any reason to pursue this further. Ma'am, you and your HOA don't have jurisdiction here. So, I suggest you leave this man in peace." And for the first time, I saw Karen truly at a loss for words, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, her lawyer awkwardly clearing his throat and mumbling something about further review before quickly shoving his papers back into his briefcase. And though Karen finally turned on her heel and stalked back to her SUV in defeat, she threw one last dagger over her shoulder, hissing, "This isn't over. You'll regret crossing me." And then she sped off with her little entourage in tow, leaving behind only the fading echo of her tires on the gravel and the bitter taste of conflict that I knew wasn't finished, not by a long shot. Because Karen wasn't the kind of person to admit defeat gracefully, she was the kind who would stew in her anger, rally her supporters, and come back harder the next time. And while I felt a sense of victory watching her retreat, I also felt a gnawing unease. Because now the battle lines had been clearly drawn, and it was only a matter of time before she escalated again. And so I went back to work with a renewed sense of vigilance, reinforcing the fence line, installing cameras around the cabin, and making sure every inch of my land was documented, because if she wanted a war, I was going to be ready. But even with all that preparation, I couldn't fully shake the image of her face as the sheriff sided with me. The way her mask of smug superiority cracked, just enough to show the fury boiling beneath, and I knew she would channel that fury into her next move. A move I had to be ready for, because while I had won this round, the war for my land had only just begun. For a few weeks after the showdown with the sheriff, I almost let myself believe that Karen had finally been put in her place, because the property was quiet, no more strange cars creeping up the driveway, no trespassing signs mysteriously nailed to trees, and the air around the cabin returned to the peaceful rhythm I had missed so much during those 3 years away. But deep down, I knew better than to trust that silence, because people like Karen didn't just slink away in defeat. They regrouped, reloaded, and came back harder, and sure enough, one Saturday morning as I was patching up a loose board on the porch, I heard the distant rumble of multiple engines, and when I stepped out into the clearing, I saw a full convoy rolling up the drive. Not just Karen's SUV this time, but 3 more vehicles filled with people I recognized from the nearby subdivision, HOA loyalists who had always followed her lead like sheep, and together they spilled out of their cars carrying cameras, measuring tapes, and even lawn chairs, as if they were setting up some kind of bizarre occupation, and Karen herself marched to the front, her face red with fury and her voice shrill as she declared, "This property has been deemed a hazard to the community, and we are here to enforce compliance until the courts can resolve ownership." And before I could even respond, her little army began marching around the cabin, snapping photos, taking notes, and shouting out bogus infractions like overgrown brush near the lake and unregistered structure addition, as if they had any authority to conduct an inspection here. And though the sheer audacity of it made my blood boil, I forced myself to remain calm because I had anticipated something like this. And with my phone already recording, I walked right up to Karen and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "You and your cronies are trespassing on private property, and if you don't leave immediately, I'll have the sheriff back out, here to haul you off." But she just sneered, "Go ahead, call him. The community has every right to protect itself, and once we show how neglected this land is, the court will strip it from you." And that was when I pulled out my trump card, the folder I had been keeping on the porch ever since the last encounter, filled not only with my deed and tax records, but also with the sheriff's written statement from our previous meeting confirming my ownership and lack of HOA jurisdiction. And as I held it up for everyone to see, I could see doubt flicker in the eyes of some of her followers, but Karen, stubborn as ever, shouted, "Don't listen to him. He's lying. That sheriff is corrupt, and this so-called deed is probably forged," which might have sounded convincing to someone who didn't know her. But to those who had been dragged along on her crusade time and again, the cracks in her credibility were beginning to show, and I decided to push the advantage, raising my voice to the whole group. "Look around you. Does this look like HOA land? This is private property passed down in my family for generations, and Karen has been lying to you, using you to try to steal what isn't hers, and if you stick around, you're all complicit in trespassing." And I could see the hesitation grow, 2 of the men actually lowering their cameras, one woman folding up her measuring tape, and muttering that she didn't sign up to get in legal trouble. But Karen saw her grip slipping and screamed, "No! Don't you dare back down. This is about protecting our community values. This man doesn't belong here, and I won't stop until this land is under proper control." And the way her voice cracked at the end betrayed just how desperate she had become. So I did what needed to be done. I dialed the sheriff right there on speakerphone, explained the situation calmly, and within 30 minutes his cruiser pulled up again, lights flashing, and he stepped out looking none too pleased to have to deal with Karen for a second time in as many weeks. And as he surveyed the crowd on my property, he sighed and said, "Ma'am, I warned you already, this is private land, and bringing a mob out here doesn't change that. So unless you all want to spend the night in county lockup, I suggest you pack up your things and leave now." And though some of Karen's diehard loyalists grumbled, most of them quickly retreated to their vehicles, clearly unwilling to risk an arrest record over her obsession. And as the convoy began to thin, Karen stood there trembling with rage, her eyes boring into me like she wished she could burn me off the land with sheer willpower, and she spat, "This isn't over. I'll take this to the highest court if I have to. You can't stop me." And I smiled, holding up the sheriff's statement once more and replying, "You can waste your time and money all you want, Karen, but you'll never take this land from me." And with that final exchange, she finally stormed back to her SUV, slamming the door so hard it echoed through the trees, and though I watched her taillights disappear down the drive, I knew she'd never fully give up because people like her thrived on control and losing was like death to them. But as I stood there on my porch with the sheriff nodding in approval beside me, I also knew one thing for certain. No matter how many times she came back, no matter how many tricks she tried to pull, I would always be here, standing guard over the cabin my family built, the land that was mine by right, and if Karen wanted a war, then she had chosen the wrong man to fight, because this time, I wasn't going anywhere.